on inequality. And if I think about the European context as a whole, I would say that the rollback of what I would call the social democratic consensus and the social welfare state, both in Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and we're at the 30th anniversary of the events of 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, and this sort of accelerated a process in which the golden age of social democracy, as historians call it, came to an end. And on both sides of the former divide in Europe, we see changes taking place in which, say, the political establishments, they have not questioned these methods or measures, and this has led to growing resentment in society, which is one of the factors that has increased or facilitated certain phenomena like populism. Another problem that I would highlight, I mean, I think there are several problems and they're intertwined, but more adamant in the region that I am is really the prevalence. I wouldn't even say the rise, but the prevalence and the strengthening of nationalism and ethno-nationalism, especially when we think of a project of, well, we have European integration, and if we're thinking about uniting Europe, we right now see this upsurge of nationalism, and in part this is linked to the process of European integration. It's linked to the process of globalization, because again, when I compare inequality and the social welfare state, one of the big problems in Europe where we still have nation states vis-a-vis this supranational project is that governments have lost control over economic policy. Many governments, especially in Eastern Europe, where after '89, I mean, we have, since the big financial crisis, we have the issue of austerity, but what often gets forgotten is that Eastern Europe got austerity measures from '89. People took those measures in for nearly 2 decades. But governments, once they entered the EU, people had expectations that things will improve drastically and especially rapidly. This did not happen. Governments, on the other hand, resorted to nationalism, to blaming Brussels. And in this sense, the political class and the elites are very much also to blame for the situation and the problems we're seeing right now. When people talk about populism, I actually see a problem in the rise of a kind of authoritarianism, and this is right now the big challenge to democracy, because it is an important question we should ask us: why is authoritarianism actually quite popular? Because let's not kid ourselves. These governments, what we hear that are problematic, actually do have a measure of popular support. In part, and this is very much, if I just take the example of Poland, these governments have actually started implementing social welfare policies. They have taken the old social democratic method. So we talk a lot about the financial crisis, how it impacted Poland. Poland is actually the exception. This is the one country that did not experience the financial crisis. It had GDP growth to 4% during the crisis years. There was a joke in Poland, and when people complained about the government in those years, they see, look, I mean, it's so bad, even the crisis failed in Poland. So, but the downside of this is that this growth was fueled by actually the same, there is no alternative policies. People were hearing in Poland that, well, Poland is the miracle of the transition. But if it was such a miracle, many, for instance, young Poles were wondering why their wages were still lower than wages of their peers in Greece, and Greece being supposedly the economic basket case of the European Union at the time. And this understandably provoked a backlash. And when you have a party coming up and promising after years that they would implement child benefits, family support systems, this naturally made them popular. That was not even an ideological, a populist issue. This was pure social democratic principles of redistributing wealth, and it worked. They implemented it. This is one very important thing to understand, that the right-wing, radical right, populists or authoritarian-leaning parties, they are actually implementing, one could say, socialist policies to a certain extent. One, we should not run away from talking about it, from debating it. I'm not somebody who's, for instance, in favor of legitimizing the far right. But there is a lot of talk about, well, we need to fight fake news, we need to fight disinformation, we need to do fact-checking. Well, that's all good and well, but you need this to resonate. And you only get it to resonate if you are confronting the other side, preferably in debate, preferably, I wouldn't say a safe space, but a neutral zone. We need somehow to kind of find the center. We actually need a real square, so to speak, where we can come together, but where we don't shy away from the problems and trying to think about that. And I think the other thing, and I know I'm a bit vague here, but is just we perhaps also need to think out of the box. I mean, ideologies and worldviews matter, but sometimes you need to go and try and resolve things practically without trying to pin it in a certain ideology, because otherwise you get this kind of problem. If you need redistributive policies and the left doesn't want to do it, the far right will. I think the warning signs is that, I mean, we are generally seeing not atomization, as once was called, but a kind of polarization in society. We see a kind of disintegration of the social fabric through various processes, even technology. People are standing on a train platform, they don't look at each other, they look at their smartphone. But at the same time, what we see is that the political center is being eroded. People are talking about politics is getting radicalized. It's actually getting fragmented, and we see polarization. Groups don't intermingle. Now, when we talk about the occupation of the squares, let's re-examine the narrative, the evidence. Who was on the squares? These were diverse groups. We don't always know which groups become more influential over time. And this, I think, is the main lesson from Eastern Europe. And I'd like to reiterate this because I've seen this narrative before. I've seen this narrative in the 1980s and 89 when Western European intellectuals equated anti-communist opposition with liberals. Turns out that a lot of those anti-communist opposition activists were not very liberal. They were already nationalists, conservative, but they were definitely not liberal. Many among the younger cohort of those activists are actually the people we are now talking about as nationalists, authoritarians, populists. They have not necessarily changed their views. They were waiting for this moment. So when we look at the squares and we have this discussion about what we saw in Spain or Greece, historical traditions matter. I mean, if you go to Greece, you know that there is a long-standing tradition of activism at universities, for instance. So, of course, these traditions carry on. Well, let's look at the universities. Let's look at the young people in Eastern Europe, see what reigns there, and you can draw some different conclusions. And there are cautionary tales to be told about that. Many of the problems we're talking about, or challenges to democracy, if you look at it from the point of view of a historian, this is like a little drop on a hot plate, right? I mean, we have processes in our society that are going on for 2-3 centuries. So these 2-3 years, will they matter? I mean, like what I said earlier is that 10-15 years from now, we might be talking about very different things. I think so. I mean, for a long time, we've been trying to think of like, what is the way forward? I mean, there are certain issues that you cannot resolve immediately. Obviously, there are issues that would be hard to tackle without a general, let's say, political will on different sides and different parts of the social hierarchy. But I do think that it should be possible to build consensuses on certain issues and take it one step at a time. I mean, you cannot overcome divisions or the societies that are so fractured right now and from one day to the next. I think you'll have to start with thinking about building consensuses and trying to build bigger consensuses, and in this mind somehow we need to rethink the concept of solidarity, because one of the troubling things I see, and I see this, it's not only Eastern Europe, I see this in Western European societies, we don't talk to the other side anymore. It's a black and white game. I mean, let's just think about the United States. I mean, we saw the most polarizing election in 2016. People are not talking to each other, but I was in Europe, and what part of the problem of our technologies was that, let's say, all my friends and contacts were people who basically couldn't imagine that the outcome of the election as it was. And for that reason, it came as a big surprise. In Eastern Europe, I've always tried, also as a researcher, to try and talk to all sides, try and understand it. And understanding doesn't mean you need to agree with it or endorse it, right? But it is important. And I'm less surprised by things in Eastern Europe. And this is just some food for thought.